Great. I believe it's recording now. Over to you, Catherine. Thanks for coming.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very much looking forward to talking with you all. So I'm just going to try and share my PowerPoint, which is so I hope, is that visible to you?
Perfect.
Fantastic. Great. Okay. So friends often spent years apart from one another in the Roman Empire, as did family members, whether it was in the service of government, trade, or in pursuit of education, or just trying to make money in the sprawling expanse of the empire. Letters sustained and promoted a huge range of personal networks, ranging from the official to the intimate, often extended over vast distances. Cicero's letters to his friends collection includes numerous addressees in provinces like Gaul or Africa, Greece, Asia Minor, and Spain. His letters to his friend Atticus, separate collection, whether sent from his various places of exile, from his provincial posting in distant Cilicia and modern Turkey, or from his own houses in Rome and in the countryside, they frequently dwell on friendships, which are often themselves sustained by letter, with a whole host of other individuals. And Cicero presents a key function of letter writing as precisely the confirmation of friendship. Written a century later, Seneca's letters to Lucilius, known as the Epistulae Morales, the letters on ethics perhaps, composed late in the author's life, constitute a very different body of material with a very particular agenda, one of philosophical self-improvement. 124 letters survive, exploring a wide range of topics, but with a shift towards more heavyweight philosophical material in the later and longer letters. Cicero's letters were among Seneca's models, but he also drew on philosophical correspondence, such as the letters attributed to Plato and associated with Epicurus and his circle. Seneca was certainly very interested in friendship and wrote a treatise on the subject, though that hasn't survived. And friendship is a significant topic in the letters, but his primary concern here is the role of friendship in the life of the would-be philosopher. While mutual friends are occasionally mentioned, that's always for a philosophical purpose. The spotlight is on the relationship between Seneca and his single addressee, Lucilius. Letters are sometimes characterized by Romans as imperfect substitutes for face-to-face interaction. In some letters, as we shall see, Seneca expresses an intense longing to be in the same place as his friend and sole addressee, Lucilius. But I shall be arguing that Seneca presents the epistolary nature of his relationship with Lucilius, that's to say the fact that they're communicating via letter, as ultimately more effective from the perspective of philosophical development than meetings in person would have been. Letters are, it turns out, the ideal medium for a truly philosophical friendship. Perhaps we could think about this for virtual meetings as well. This model of philosophical friendship also informs and reinforces, I shall argue, Seneca's distinctive notion of philosophical and intellectual community, a community which can transcend separation in space, but also separation in time. This community too is brought together by the written word. Seneca's letters are predicated on the extended separation of author and addressee. At times, Lucilius himself is evoked as a vividly imagined physical presence. In letter 49, for instance, Seneca recalls the last time he saw his friend. There are times when the sense of loss hidden away in our hearts is quickened by familiar places. It's not that they bring back memories that are gone, but rather that they rouse them from dormancy, just as mourner's grief, though dulled by time, may be provoked by the sight of the dead person's young slave, or his cloak, or his house. So yes, Campania, and especially the sight of Naples and your Pompeii, made my sense of your absence unbelievably fresh. There you are, before my eyes. I'm about to part from you. I see you choking down your tears, and despite your efforts to check them, not managing to hold back your emotions, I seem to have lost you just a moment ago. Not exactly a very stoic scene, we might think. Seneca's longing for absent Lucilius, who is away serving as a government official in Sicily, seems as acute as Cicero's for his close friend Atticus in the darkest times of his exile. Seneca conveys not just the pain of the moment of departure from Lucilius, would they ever see one another again, but also the anguish of remembering his loss, his continued separation from his friend. It's a kind of bereavement. Elsewhere, Seneca in his letters can sometimes seem rather unfeeling in his exhortations. Letter 63, consoling Lucilius on the death of a friend, simply exhorts him to find another one to replace the dead friend. But here is one of the moments when his humanity seems rather more vividly realised. For Seneca, friendship's importance lies in its role in the pursuit of philosophy. The Peripatetics had stressed the importance of friendship to moral development, for instance, Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics, but this view is not universal. In letter 9, Seneca takes issue with those who hold that the philosopher has no need of friends, a claim attributed to Stilbo and it seems also to the Cynics. Because the wise man is self-sufficient, he has no interest in utilitarian friendships, Seneca makes clear, but he pursues true friendship as an object of intrinsic beauty. It is natural promptings which draw him to friendship, so the idea of living in accordance with nature. For Seneca, the title friend is not to be bestowed lightly. He opens letter 3 with a remonstration to Lucilius. You handed over your letters to be passed on to me to one you refer to as friend. At once you warn me not to discuss with him all the matters that concern you, saying that even you yourself are not in the habit of doing this. Thus, in the same letter, you've asserted and denied he is your friend. The letter goes on. Consider for a long time whether to admit a given person to your friendship, but when you've decided to admit him, welcome him with your whole heart. Speak with him as boldly as with yourself. Letter 7 also dwells at length on the need for care in choosing one's associates. Accept someone as a friend if he can improve you or you can improve him. So friends are very much part of a project of self-improvement. A more technical exploration of this idea is a concern of letter 48. Friendship creates between us a partnership in all things. Nothing is favourable or adverse for just one of us. We live for a common purpose. No one can live happily if he thinks only of himself and turns everything to serve his own uses. You must live for another if you want to live for yourself. And that's, I think, a very interesting idea. This partnership, observed with care and respect, which has joined us as men with men and judges that there is some right common to humanity, serves most effectively to develop that inner partnership and friendship which I was telling you about. For the man who has much in common with mankind will have everything in common with his friend. Now, friendship here seems to be a relationship of mutuality and of equality. Our feelings towards our friends both stand for and serve as the first stage of our connection to humanity much more generally. So we should note that this philosophical discussion of the meaning of friendship and its relationship to the Stoic doctrine of oikeiosis immediately precedes letter 49's highly charged evocation of the pain of separation. So there's a sort of interesting juxtaposition, I think, there. But already in letter 9, the account of Stoic friendship has some distinctive features. The philosopher Attalus is given as the source for what seems a rather one-sided view of friendship, so it's a somewhat different take. He used to say, it's more pleasant to make a friend than to have one, as it is more pleasant to the artist to paint than to have completed a painting. When one is preoccupied and absorbed in one's work, the absorption itself gives great delight. And when one has withdrawn one's hand from the completed artwork, the pleasure is not the same. The wise man, self-sufficient though he may be, nevertheless wishes to have a friend, if only for the purpose of practicing friendship, in order that his great virtue may not lie unused. So it's a very interesting idea of the friend as a kind of artifact almost. And while Seneca appears later in this letter to dismiss the idea of friendship as motivated by self-interest, the focus here is very much on the friend in relation to the wise man and the wise man's scope to exercise his virtue. Now, Seneca never terms himself a wise man in the sort of technical Stoic sense. But there are numerous occasions in the letters when he assumes the role of philosophical craftsman. A later letter praises Lucilius' philosophical progress with the arresting exclamation, "I claim you for myself, you are my handiwork." Lucilius, insofar as he's progressed as a would-be philosopher, is Seneca's creation. Still, if Seneca presents Lucilius as under construction here, he often refers to himself in rather similar terms. At 6:1, for instance, he writes that he feels himself to be undergoing a transformation, me transfigurare in the Latin. In similar vein, letter 27 opens with the observation that Seneca's words of guidance are addressed as much to himself as they are to his correspondent. He too must attempt to bridge the gap between his current self, that's to say his sort of self in the present, if you like, which is prone to a multitude of lapses, and his normative self, the self he aspires to become, and that distinction is one coined by Tony Long. He too must attempt, Seneca too must, the work of self-improvement then is a shared project. Lucilius might also seem to be Seneca's creation as a friend. Letter 35, however, makes clear that as Lucilius is still very much work in progress, the term friend cannot yet be properly applied to him. It's a rather sort of paradoxical moment. When I exhort you to study, it is my own interest I'm pursuing. I want you as my friend, but that's not possible unless you carry on developing yourself in the manner in which you've started. For now, you love me, but you're not my friend. So that's, I think, a really interesting idea of the friend as a kind of actually quite a specific kind of role, and you have to work hard to be able to fulfill that role properly. So the term friend here has a significance much more strictly circumscribed than earlier on. The sight of a man, his presence, communion with him, brings something of true pleasure, so long as he is not only the person you want, but the kind of person you want. Seneca also has this comment to make about becoming the ideal friend. So Lucilius is advised to hurry to find Seneca, but more immediately to hurry to find himself. In letter 35, direct personal connection is desired, but it's deferred. In the meantime, Seneca's letters, insistent goads to self-improvement, offer a more focused medium of exchange. It's actually better for them to be communicating by letter at this point where Lucilius is still at an early stage in his journey. I think that's quite a kind of disconcerting moment in the letters, and we could see the coolness of letter 35 here as a rather a far cry from the longing so vividly conveyed in that passage from letter 49 about when they said their goodbyes. Though it's also true that one motive Seneca offers for wanting Lucilius to hurry up is that he wants to be the beneficiary of Lucilius' friendship, and he's already an old man, so he's concerned about, he needs to get on with things while he still has life left in him. The shifts between Seneca's letters appear quite carefully calculated, I think. The sense of longing, the desire in letter 49 both is and is not for the person who is last glimpsed choking back his tears as the two men parted. Now, to come back to Cicero again, who is an important model for Seneca, particularly in his letters to his friend Atticus, to whom he wrote many, many letters over the years, he can be found celebrating the power of a letter to connect. We might note, for instance, I do believe me take a short break from these miseries when I am, as it were, talking to you, even more so when I'm reading your letters, writes Cicero. So he's kind of finding relief from present misery in that sense of, reading a letter is like being with Atticus. But in more troubled moments, sometimes for Cicero, the letter can become an emblem of separation. His letters from exile are stained with tears. Tears obliterate the letters he receives as he tries to read them. So their letters are a reminder of separation rather than of connection. He worries about the accidents that might befall his letters in transit. Now, by contrast, Seneca rarely considers the letter as a physical object. Hardly ever refers to how long they might take to reach him or anything like that. Rather, for Seneca, the letter is a kind of live connection between the sender and the receiver. he attributes to Lucilius a complaint about how informal his letters are. You complain the letters you receive from me are not finely honed. Now, who talks finely unless he also wants to talk affectedly? I want my letters to be just as my conversation would be if you and I were sitting or having a stroll together, spontaneous and easy, for my letters have nothing laboured or artificial about them. Reading a letter should feel like being in the presence of its author. And Seneca claims to experience this feeling himself when he reads Lucilius's letters. I never receive a letter from you without being immediately in your company. If the pictures of our absent friends bring pleasure, though they only refresh the memory and alleviate our longing by a solace that is unreal and insubstantial, how much more pleasant is a letter which brings us real traces, real marks of an absent friend. For that which is sweetest when we set eyes on one another is offered by the pressure of a friend's hand on his letter, recognition. This passage vividly conveys both the pain of separation and the sweet power of the letter to alleviate that pain, transporting its author to its addressee and making their communication feel immediate. The written word in the right hands can generate an effect of real presence. Here, as in letter 49, Seneca articulates the singular delight to be found in the physical presence of his friend. I mean, so that's, I think, quite an interesting aspect here. Now, Seneca, like Cicero, repeatedly compares his exchange of letters with Lucilius to conversation. The comparison serves in part to occlude the absence of Lucilius' side of this exchange. And Seneca's letter collection is all from Seneca, nothing from Lucilius. So it is very one-sided, except where Seneca chooses to imagine Lucilius's interventions. But conversation itself, we should note, has a particular philosophical role in the Stoic project. Rightly you insist, this is letter 38, rightly you insist that we exchange these letters more frequently. Talk is most beneficial because it infiltrates the mind gradually. Set-piece lectures prepared in advance and poured out in front of a crowd make more noise but have less intimacy. Philosophy is good advice. No one declaims advice. Seneca is dismissive of the power of lectures as a medium of instruction and stresses rather the superior value of the cumulative exchange of conversation in introducing the lessons of philosophy into the spirit of the would-be wise man. In the same vein, an earlier letter in Seneca's collection stresses it was everyday interaction, a shared life, his teacher's living voice, which brought such benefits to the earlier Stoic Cleanthes, disciple of one of the founders of Stoicism, Zeno. Now, the letter's resemblance to conversation makes it the closest proxy for spoken interaction when spoken interaction isn't possible. So letters are thus particularly apt as a mode of philosophical instruction from Seneca's perspective. Now, that model perhaps implies the letter is essentially a substitute for face-to-face interaction, while the spoken exchange remains the ideal. In relation to the world of Roman elite society, epistolary exchange in general is often characterized as standing for the preferred form of direct personal communication. Now, some of Seneca's letters might support the view that personal presence trumps the letter from a social, emotional, and from a philosophical perspective. But elsewhere it becomes clear that the letter may achieve effects of a different order from those of a personal encounter. The power of the letter to bridge, to ally distance, can, under the right circumstances, be extended still further. The letter is a stimulus which prompts the reader to understand he may have his friend with him, not only when he reads his letters or writes to him, but whenever he wishes. Letter 55 places Seneca in Campania, the native region of Lucilius, as letter 49 underlines, while Lucilius himself is still absent in Sicily. Seneca encourages his correspondent to imagine himself in Campania also. And so you should not think that you are less well off because you're not now in Campania. But why are you not there? You only have to direct your thoughts to be there also. It's permitted to converse with friends who are absent as often as you like indeed, and for as long as you like. But this pleasure is greatest and we get most benefit from it when we are absent. But the presence of friends makes us fussy, and because we can speak with them, walk with them, sit with them at any time, when we separate, we give no thought to those whom we saw a moment ago. And indeed, we ought to bear absence with composure, because all of us spend time apart, even when we're in the same place. For here, we should include nighttime spent separately, their friends' different occupations, their private studies, their separate outings in the countryside, so we'll see travel does not take much from us. A friend should be held on to in the spirit. A friend of this kind can never be absent. He can see every day whoever he wishes to see. So, study with me, dine with me, walk with me. We would be living in narrow constraints if anything were shut off from our thoughts. I see you, my Lucilis, and I hear you most vividly. To such a degree am I with you that I'm wondering if I shouldn't start writing you notes rather than letters. I think this is a very interesting moment in the correspondence here, where Seneca highlights the power of the imagination to transcend distance, and indeed the power of the imagination to actually do a better job than kind of real presence in some ways. The sequence of letters, beginning with letter 49, documents Seneca's extended tour of the area around the Bay of Naples. In 55, as in 49, in letter 49, Campagna offers Seneca vivid reminders of Lucilis's absence, though in this case, it's Lucilis' response to that absence, which is his focus. The strategies Seneca advocates are ones to be adopted by himself as well as by Lucilis. Each must summon up the image of the other, imagine his voice. Everyday interactions are to be mentally rehearsed. Seneca ends on a humorous note. Rather than writing long letters, he and Lucilis should scribble one another brief notes, as one would to a friend one might see in a few hours. Yet even while letter 55 conveys the intensity of Seneca and Lucilis' desire to be in each other's company, Seneca suggests strikingly that we can enjoy friendship most, derive greatest benefit from it, precisely when we are apart from our friends. This is a rather different claim from the one made in letter 35, which I talked about a moment ago, where Seneca suggests Lucilis is not yet ready for direct personal interaction. The specific techniques Seneca proposes for keeping one's friend in mind are important. This understanding of friendship gives a particular role to mental reflection, cogitatio in the Latin. Present, we take our friends for granted. Absence, insofar as it serves to prompt the right kind of reflection on friendship, hones that friendship into something truly valuable. The claim Seneca makes challenges the Aristotelian stress on the importance of proximity for friendship. For Stoics, as indeed for Epicureans, physical proximity was not essential. This is almost certainly an idea Seneca explored at greater length in that lost treatise, of which only a few fragments survive. When informed by mental reflection, cogitatio, one's engagement with an absent friend is more focused, more considered than the casual face-to-face encounters one has, even with those to whom one is most attached. This is a kind of spiritualization of friendship, I think we might say. Before we pursue further the ways in which correspondence may be superior to face-to-face encounters, we should consider another related strand in the letters, one concerning more particularly the issue of community. For Seneca, there are important parallels between the relationship of absent friends on the one hand, and the relationship of the would-be philosopher to earlier thinkers and practitioners of philosophy on the other. The letters contain much advice on how to get the most out of one's reading as a key part of philosophical education. Seneca stresses, for instance, the importance of reading the whole text rather than just looking for eye-catching quotes. Or even in letter 2, which has quite a programmatic function, I think, the importance of choosing carefully which books you read rather than sampling indiscriminately corresponds exactly with advice about choosing friends in the same letter. Reading books might also be imagined in terms of personal connection with the author. This was evidently an established trope. We find Cicero in a letter to the scholar Varro of 47 BCE, writing, with relief he's renewed relations with his books, his old friends who've granted him forgiveness for his earlier neglects. They're kind of a move to sort of personify his books. And Seneca, in his treatise on the brevity of life, urges that rather than wasting time on the arduous and humiliating social duties of contemporary Roman life, one should focus one's attention on great thinkers of the past. Nature, he says, allows us to enter into communion with every age. And those devoted to the true duties of life are not the frequenters of the hallways of Rome's powerful, he contends, but rather those who, this is letter 14, who want to have as their closest intimates on a daily basis Zeno, Pythagoras and Democritus and the other bastions of the art of right living, who want Aristotle and Theophrastus. So you should be hanging out with those guys rather than kind of, powerful Romans of your own day. The parallel he develops here with the rituals of Roman social life serves to emphasize the habitual and interactive nature of what should be one's engagement with philosophical authorities. You don't just read them once, you keep going back to them, just as you would with your powerful Roman patron, go and visit him every day. That's a very important part of the relationship between patron and client in Roman society. Seneca evokes what Gareth Williams terms a counter-society of philosophers. But while earlier Stoics seem to have imagined a rather abstract association of wise men, Seneca fleshes out their encounters by evoking that specific Roman detail of the morning greeting ritual, the salutatio. Here, Seneca does not refer explicitly to reading, it's true, to the role of the text as proxy for a partner in conversation. In this regard as well, the model of conversation is perhaps more evident and has particular resonance in the letters, where Seneca often urges his correspondent to imagine figures from the past as physically present to him. The virtual philosophical conversation is a key concern of a bunch of letters later in the collection too. And in this respect, letter 64, as we shall see shortly, articulates most explicitly the Stoic notion of the community of the wise. The great philosophical figures of the past, Zeno, Epicurus, Socrates, Cato, are repeatedly held up as models for the would-be philosopher. But of course, they can only be encountered through texts. Interestingly, Seneca regularly groups together philosophers known for their writings with those such as Socrates, known only via the writings of others. Seneca's incantatory prose works hard to summon up these men as individual presences whose behaviour, vividly described, can still be exemplary. Indeed, this is a dialogic relationship, for they themselves can also, at least in the correctly trained imagination, bear witness to the virtue of the would-be philosopher generations later. Letter 11 concludes with advice from Epicurus, which is a characteristic of many of the letters in the earlier books of Seneca's collection. We need to cherish a man of virtue and keep him always before our eyes so that we live as if he were watching us and order all our actions as if he saw them. Happy is the man who can make others better, not just when he's with them, but even when he's in their thoughts. So choose therefore a Cato, or if Cato seems too severe a model, choose a man of gentler disposition, a Laelius. Choose one whose life, whose manner of speech and whose face, displaying his spirit, have satisfied you. Picture him always to yourself as your protector or your pattern. Now, the would-be philosopher here, drawing on his reading, as well as remembering his own mentors, must develop a mental image of his model, picturing him in his mind's eye and conjuring up his voice in his imagination. Now, there's perhaps a touch of humour in the idea that one might reject Cato for the role of moral overseer on the grounds of his excessive severity. But this can also be seen as an aspect of the personalised nature of moral choices in Stoic thought. It's entirely in line with this approach that different individuals will find different moral exemplars more fitting to their own characters. Seneca himself has a particular fondness, it seems, for the cynic Demetrius. Demetrius, for instance, the best of men, I take around with me, and leaving the wearers of purple, I talk with him half naked as he is, and hold him in high esteem. And here we see this very interesting kind of conflation of Seneca going around doing his public duties and imagining as his companion Demetrius half naked, as a kind of juxtaposition with the kind of fancily dressed Romans he's obliged to spend time with, including, of course, the Emperor Nero, whom Seneca never mentions. Seneca offers this imaginative move as a strategy for stepping back from the immediate social and political pressures exerted by one's associates in public life. Summon up Demetrius as your companion. The contrast between his physical appearance and that of the finely robed politicians and officials will serve as a reminder of the contrast between his values, those one ought to share, and theirs. Visualizing Demetrius' appearance triggers the would-be philosopher's focus on Demetrius' words. Letter 55 claimed that with the right use of mental reflection, one could derive greatest pleasure from friends when one separated from them. And is this perhaps also true of one's relationship to earlier philosophers? It might actually be better not to meet Demetrius in person, but only to imagine one's own Demetrius. Now, Seneca in letter 63, which addresses Lucilius' grief at the loss of his friend Flaccus, argues that the temporary separations from friends, occasioned by travel or other constraints, which one learns to tolerate in life, may be seen as a kind of preparation for the permanent separation brought by death. So let us eagerly enjoy our friends, since we do not know how long this opportunity will be open to us. Let us think how often we shall leave them when we go on long journeys, and how often we shall fail to see them when we stay together in the same place, and we shall thus understand that we have lost too much time in their company while they were still alive. This advice was, it seems, a staple of consolation literature and offers comfort even to those of limited philosophical attainment. Yet the mental techniques enjoined in letter 63 in relation to friends from whom one separated have a close affinity with those advocated in letter 11 in relation to earlier generations of philosophers, and practiced by Seneca in relation to Demetrius in letter 62. And this affinity becomes especially visible in letter 64, which is the last one I'm going to talk about. I know, this the last one. So while letter 63 tackles bereavement, the opening of the following letter, 64, offers an arresting instance of separation overcome. So this letter begins, yesterday you were with us, Seneca declares to Lucilius. Some friends had come round, their identity isn't specified. A particularly cosy fire was laid. The conversation at dinner ranged over many themes. Then a book by the philosopher Quintus Sextius the Elder was read to the company. Lucilius could be thought of as present because he was in the minds of his assembled friends. But Quintus Sextius is also a presence. Seneca describes the effect of Sextius' words read out to the group. Good God, how much potency there is in him, how much spirit, says Seneca. The text and its author are strikingly elided here. And hearing the words, Seneca exclaims at the man, he's a great man, Vir Magnus. In this letter, and through this letter, the absent Lucilius and the dead Sextius can nevertheless participate in an ongoing philosophical conversation that implicitly has the potential to continue beyond the lives of Seneca and his guests, and Lucilius also. Indeed, the letter goes on to comment, I revere the discoveries of philosophy and those who discover them, but we should add to what we've inherited. Even now, much remains to do, and much will always remain, and one who is born 1,000 years from now will not be barred from the opportunity of contributing further. Seneca's own letters are addressed to future readers, 1,000 years in the future, as well as to Lucilius, and he expects a response, a contribution. Letter 67, the last text I'll be thinking about this evening, opens in a deceptively low-key manner. Seneca offers a self-consciously commonplace remark about the weather. Spring's gradually showing itself. Still, cold spells often confine the elderly Seneca to his bed, but he's grateful to old age for enforcing this confinement. Most of my converse is with books. Whenever your letters come along, I seem to be in your presence. Their effect on me is such that I seem to be not writing back to you, but taking part in a conversation. And so, as regards the subject you are asking about, as if I were chatting with you about its nature, let us investigate together. That's no personal problem that Lucilius is concerned about here, but rather that key philosophical issue, whether every good is desirable. Yet the exchange of letters here, too, is lent the immediacy of conversation. In this passage, however, it's not only the exchange between Seneca and Lucilius, which is conceived as conversation, but also Seneca's engagement with his books. The comparison underlining the interactive nature of his particular reading practice. What's modelled here is not passive reading, but interaction, engagement with what one reads. At the same time, the analogy between epistolary engagement with one's friends and engagement which can at times bear a high emotional charge lends an urgency and an emotional weight to our engagement with the philosophers of the past and indeed potentially of the future too. Seneca's model of friendship works to give a particularity, a force, and a personal investment to links with virtuous individuals, perhaps not directly known to the would-be philosopher, but fleshed out in his or even her imagination. In Seneca's hands, the letter enables the exploration of presence and absence, not only in relation to author and addressee, but also in relation to past and future generations of those aspiring to virtue. Now, letters, for reasons explored earlier, seem to privilege interaction, yet in Seneca's case, this is with a constructed correspondent. His letters should not, however, I think, be seen as entirely solipsistic. Self-improvement is presented insistently as a shared project. To transform oneself, one needs the help of the other, unless one's actually become a Stoic sage. That other might be Lucilius, but a Lucilius who is best kept at a distance, at least until he's become the kind of friend that the would-be wise man really requires. In the meantime, the distance between author and addressee allows the relationship to be honed into an ideal connection. Letters enable Seneca to focus on only those aspects of his friend's character which are germane to his philosophical project. A select group of other people also turn out to have a vital role to play in helping the would-be philosopher become his best self. Seneca, the consummate dramatist, he was also an author of numerous tragedies, offers techniques for staging life-changing encounters with figures conjured forth from memory or from written texts. The particular efficacy Seneca attributes to correspondence opens up the possibility that we can connect better with Socrates, with Cato, with Demetrius at a distance than if we were to encounter them face to face. This distance indeed allows us to craft precisely the model that we need, based on, but not perhaps limited to, what we know of these individuals from memory and from reading. Few readers perhaps can match Seneca's imaginative powers, but his analogy between epistolary exchange, itself presented in vivid conversational terms, and reading certainly serves to implicate us as readers in the conversation. The act of reading the letters, it appears, can, if done in the right way, elide their textual nature completely so that the reader is directly in contact with Seneca himself. Seneca makes clear it's not good enough merely to overhear an exchange between himself and his correspondent Lucilius, but that we too must actively engage in the epistolary conversation, no matter that we're separated not just by a stretch of the Mediterranean, but by a vast expanse of time. Those who aspire to become Seneca's friends must, like Lucilius, work hard to earn the title, yet just as Seneca exhorts his reader to construct the friend he needs, to imagine the ideal mentor, so we too may each fashion our own Seneca. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Catherine.
Now, I'll just do stop share. Is that right? Yes.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I'm just wondering if there's any questions anybody wants to ask. I've got one question about Lucilius. Do we know whether it was a fictional character or could it?
Well, I mean, he's quite plausibly fleshed out in a sense, but we only know about him from Seneca's work. So that is, I mean, he's the dedicatee of the Natural Questions and of another text as well. So he does sort of crop up in several different Senecan texts, but it is only through Seneca that we know about him. So if we were feeling, you know, I suppose distrustful, we could imagine a kind of conspiracy on Seneca's part. But I mean, I think probably Lucilius did exist, but at the same time, I mean, I think we needn't necessarily assume that the letters as we have them are exactly as they were sent to Lucilius, or that they were ever intended only for Lucilius's eyes.
Right. And of course, we haven't got any letters from Lucilius himself.
No, I mean, only insofar as sometimes Seneca will apparently quote something from Lucilius's letter within his own letter, but I don't think we should necessarily take that as very firm evidence.
Yeah. Thank you. Oh yeah, just you're radio unmuted, Luis. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, this is probably a silly question, but what's so specifically Stoic about appreciating your friends? I mean, obviously Stoicism is a virtue philosophy, big emphasis on virtue, on dichotomy of control, what you can do, what you can't do. I mean, it sounds like Epicureanism. I mean, the Epicureans also appreciated their friends, and Aristotle. I mean, it's all. I don't disagree with any of it. I'm just struggling to understand what's so Stoic about it.
Well, I think that's a very good question. I suppose one way in which one could see friendship as having a specifically Stoic dimension to it is the way in which friendship is a kind of stepping stone for forging connections with one's community more generally. I mean, I think one of the ways in which I suppose Seneca's take on friendship in the letters, and indeed his take on relationships generally, is not particularly focused on the broader community, and we could see that as partly a function of the stage in his life when he's writing these letters. He's sort of taken a step back from politics. He's not really reflecting on the polity at this point, but he's very much kind of turned, you know, he's very much in retreat from all that. But nevertheless, I think, you know, for the Stoics, particularly, I mean, Roman Stoics have a very firm sense of the importance of social duty and obligation to one's community, and that sort of sense of kind of, you know, that movement from self-love to being a kind of a citizen of the cosmopolis, that has to be kind of achieved through a sort of gradual extension of affection from oneself to one's family and friends, and outward from that. So friends have a place in that kind of trajectory. But that's not something, you're right that that's not something that Seneca particularly highlights. He's more interested in I suppose that sort of sense of an individual philosophical journey, and how the kind of interaction between friends has a key part to play in that.
Yeah, and also Seneca sort of stresses the fact that the friendship with the Stoics is not like the idea that the Epicureans have, which is like a fair weather friendship, but rather one where you're doing something for your friend. He puts the emphasis on what you can do for your friend, and in that sense, I think it's quite Stoic, isn't it? Leo.
Hi
and
there.
then Phil.
Thanks for your talk. I just wondered, did Epictetus or Marcus Aurelius have much to say on the subject of friendship? And is this just Seneca, or do you think it's a Stoic representation?
I mean, I think it is specifically Stoic, but it's also true that in some ways, I mean, Epictetus is I think perhaps less interested in kind of perhaps the individualized character of the would-be philosopher. So that sort of sense that you that I think is quite apparent in Seneca, that you find role models that are quite specific to you. You find friends that kind of are people who you connect with, and it's that quite specific connection that's going to help you in your personal journey. and Marcus Aurelius does, I mean, the beginning of his meditations is very much focused on, what he owes to a whole host of different people. I mean, it's quite interesting that that's quite a different take on Marcus Aurelius from what we get, for instance, from the letters of Fronto, between Fronto and the young Marcus Aurelius, where there is a kind of warmth, but one that could be in some ways contextualized within quite a sort of a Platonic tradition of engagement as well. So yes, I mean, I think it's that sort of sense of what our obligations are to other people is kind of important throughout Stoic writers.
Thanks. Yeah, I read Meditations as more an homage to the important people in his life, whereas I think from this, Seneca seems to be referring to more of an interdependence, which seems a bit unstoic in some respects.
Well, I mean, I think I disagree that it's unstoic. I mean, I think in some ways that the idea that is often that we often see referred to the Stoic as self-sufficient is actually quite misleading in some ways, because the Stoic is conceived of as having a role in a community, and community is important for one's, that's kind of living in accordance with nature, is not living on your own, it's living as part of a community.
Yeah, because it's suiciding, but it seems to me there's a bit of a contradiction in terms between this idea of the Stoic person being so pro-social and then stating that at least the wise man can be self-sufficient.
Well, I suppose, I mean, it depends what you mean by self-sufficiency. I suppose, letter 9 talks about how the wise man doesn't actually need friends. The wise man isn't, in a sense, the wise man can still be perfectly virtuous without friends, and yet friendship is nevertheless a value to be. I mean, Stoics get into difficult territory when they start talking about preferred and dispreferred indifference, don't they? But friendship is very much a preferred indifferent, and in some ways it's kind of more than that, because the idea of the cosmopolis, of the community of the wise, that the sense of community is important there. It's not just being a wise person on your own, but being part of the cosmopolis. And I think admittedly that idea isn't always to the fore. And there are circumstances where Stoics reflect rather on how you can still be virtuous even in a situation of extreme deprivation. But that's not what you would ideally choose, and what you would ideally choose is to be part of a community.
Right. I think, Phil, did you want to ask something? You raised your hand.
Yes, thank you for your talk, Catherine. The exercises which Seneca undertook through his writings to Rosaurus sound very therapeutic. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the receptivity of your colleagues writing as philosophers and intellectual historians to the therapeutic aspects of this. One could easily imagine a psychologist devising an experiment looking into how somebody who doesn't exercise like this becomes, for example, more grateful, or for example, a couple might, for example, write a letter to a fictional friend or to a dead author from the past or such like, much like Seneca does to Rosaurus, and that psychology experiment could see how much they increase their bond together. So I'm wondering whether your colleagues, as Stoicism grows as a movement, are becoming more open to the aspects of philosophy as being something useful, which can make you more grateful, a better friend, more well bonded to your partner, etc.
Well, that's a really interesting question, and I think that that is an issue that at least some of my sort of colleagues in the world of sort of ancient studies are kind of very seriously committed to. So Chris Gill, I'm sure you come across Chris Gill, or Tony Long, who I know spoke at the Stoicon a couple of years ago. John Sellers, that they're all very serious scholars of Stoic philosophy in terms of knowing all the ancient texts and everything, but they're also really interested in the kind of I suppose the therapeutic value of the kind of advice that Seneca and Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius kind of give. So yes, that's a good point. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we've got Georgina next.
Sorry, I didn't know if I'd unmute. Catherine, if I may, thank you very much. That was very enlightening. And I guess I have a series of questions. The first one relates to the title, which is Absent Presence. And our host did make a link with what we're experiencing now. And I think it's quite relevant. One of your slides was mentioning how important it is to have a projection in our mind of our actual friend, or maybe the author. So I think the first question I had is if you've drawn any parallels in what you've been reading between the friendship that's depicted in the writings with a real friend and that which is mentioned between us and authors or those people in the past. Is there any differentiation? Because it seems that their parallels are drawn in the in your talk. I'm not quite sure if there's any distinct difference, because from where I'm standing, it is quite different to have somebody that has actually been real in one's life as opposed to reading an author and that kind of friendship where it's slightly one-sided and self-growth is perhaps a bit more limited for the author or non-existent. So that's one of the questions.
Well, of course, you're right that well, on one level, we could say self-growth is not a possibility for a dead author, but at the same time, they are always open to being reread. So, we can make our own version of Seneca and find things that perhaps Seneca wasn't aware of offering. And I think so. There's that sense in which they're not. They are subject to change, even though they're kind of, from the distant past. That the kind of process by which we encounter them is through our reading of the text, and that is an interactive process. Now, of course, there is a difference. Of course, there is between thinking about a real person who we've met in the flesh, and then kind of imagining that person when we're not in the same place as them. I mean, I think. At the same time, and perhaps this is, just to think about the historical circumstances of the Roman Empire, where obviously journeys are longer, life expectancy is shorter. In the business of governing the Roman Empire, people of Seneca's a class traveled a lot, but travel was a risky business. So very often you would be saying goodbye to a family member or a friend, and there's quite a high chance that you'd never see them again. So that sort of sense that they kind of continue to have a presence in your life, even though that they may be dead, or at least you're not actually going to see them again, is one. I can kind of see how that the work of the imagination that kind of keeps that connection kind of potent has a certain similarity with the reading, and I mean I appreciate that they are distinct things at the same time.
No, but it's very, I think, context. Yes, I hadn't thought of that. So thanks. And I think the second question has to do with Aristotle was mentioned, I think, during your talk, but I've read a lot about the way in which Aristotle defines friendship. I think he has a certain, and I was wondering if you've drawn any parallels and whether you could find how this description differs maybe from other philosophers such as Aristotle, who has spent time writing on this specifically.
Well, yes, I mean, I can't claim to know the Aristotle material very well, but I mean, the strong impression I have is that for Aristotle, friendship is about kind of being in the same place as your friend, and the kind of, your friends are people you see regularly. And Aristotle doesn't really, for Aristotle, you can't be friends with someone if you don't see them. So it's kind of, whereas for Seneca, you could imagine for Seneca, you could have a kind of long distance friendship where you actually never met your friend, you just exchanged letters. And for Seneca, that actually could be, a very good friendship. But for Aristotle, that, community is in the physical place where you are, in a way that's not the case for Seneca, and indeed also for Epicurus, that sort of sense that a community can be much more widely spread out, and you can be part of a community that's connected by exchanges of letters, rather than having to come together in the same place to be part of a community.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we got Paul Ryan. So I just want to check, Catherine, are you okay for time?
Oh, that's absolutely fine. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, thank you, Catherine, for the talk. Thank you. That's great. I want to pick up on a few threads that have gone through the questions, I think, about whether we're really thinking about Seneca in terms of friendship, or Seneca in terms of a literariness about friendship.
Mm-hmm.
I sort of feel that he's very much influenced by his quotes of Epicurus, in that he seems to really get into the pleasure of his writing and his books. And I feel that a lot of what he's writing about is the writing itself rather than friendship. So I suppose sort of linking it in with where we are in our experience of this lockdown, your title I thought was really interesting, in that it had that negative on how to cope with not seeing your friends, whereas I think often the Stoic issue is how to cope with seeing your friends. So our friendships are very much tidied up by this process. They're now, our friends are in these little boxes. We don't get all of their body language. Maybe there's some Freudian slips which don't come across when something is written. So I just wondered if you have a comment about that.
Yes, that's a very interesting thought, that in some ways Seneca finds friends easier to deal with at a distance. And perhaps, yeah. I mean, I suppose that the kind of the disembodied nature of it is perhaps significant. That sort of idea that it's a sort of, I mean, on the one hand, Seneca is actually very interested. I mean, he'll often make his writing very vivid with the use of specific, quite physical details. I mean, sort of things that are revolting or kind of, he'll bring those in. So he's not squeamish in a sense, except that he, disgust is often an emotion that seems to be kind of in his writings. I mean, but yes, I think that idea of kind of, perhaps there's a certain comfort almost in that kind of more attenuated sense of connection, which we could see as being perhaps, I mean, another really important theme in the letters is death and the prospect of death. And Seneca, he's not very well, he's elderly, and he knows that the Emperor Nero is very likely going to send him a message quite soon to tell him, to take his own life, as Nero has done for others as well. So a sort of sense of kind of letting go could be something we could see in these letters, and a sense of kind of that one has a kind of a life beyond the grave, if you like, but it's a life that is through literary immortality, and kind of people reading your work in 1,000 years' time, so that, no matter what the Emperor Nero does, Seneca will live on, in a sense.
Thank you very much. Oh, can I ask one just follow-up question about, you mentioned Cleanthes having a reputation for kind of spoken discourse and dialogue.
Yes.
What's the reference for that?
I think it might be letter 11. I just checked my pages all over the place now.
Oh, it's in Seneca's letters, is it?
Yes, it is. Yeah, yeah.
That's the only reference to it. Okay.
I think it's pretty certainly letter 11. Oh yes. Yeah. Sorry. No, it's letter 6-5 actually. It's the. Well, in fact, it's the Cleanthes is there as the disciple of Zeno. So it's the living voice of Zeno, which benefits Cleanthes. In fact. Sorry.
I'm not sure whether Lewis, did you want to ask a question again, or is your? Oh no, because you still got your hand raised. Phil, did you?
Yes, so I have a short question on when to ditch a friend or maybe a romantic partner. You mentioned that in letter 3.2, Seneca says that the title of friend is not bestowed lightly.
Yeah.
And in letter 7, he says that you should accept friends either if you can improve them or they can improve you.
Yes.
One thing which is particularly common with relationships going on a bit longer than they otherwise would is the idea of wanting to be their savior and stick about trying to improve them when it's not always possible. When do you think Seneca might advise that you ditch someone and accept that it's not a mutually good relationship anymore?
That's an interesting question. I mean, he does talk about how you shouldn't, if you don't trust someone, you shouldn't call them your friend. So that's a sort of straightforward. But then someone that you have a friendship with, and then you come to feel that actually they're not benefiting you and you are not benefiting them, at that point you should definitely draw a line under it. But he's quite sort of censorious about other people's moral failings. So I think he might quite quickly decide that someone who is wasting his time, for instance, or kind of was insufficiently grateful for a favour, might be ditched on those grounds.
Thank you.
Terry.
Thanks. Just thinking about the modernity and comparing it with Seneca. Is there something that you'd like to remove from Seneca in order to make him compatible with life today? Or would you think that there are some adjustments that need to be made to contemporary life in order to take on board Seneca's lessons? I guess talking about death is an unusual thing that we would never do in this millennium, for instance.
Yes, I mean, he's certainly a lot readier to talk about death. In fact, I mean, readier than other Stoics as well. So he is quite distinctive in his interest in reflecting on the prospect of death. That's, I think in many ways that's not a bad thing. So that might be something that I think Seneca could bring to us. What I would want to remove from Seneca, I think, would probably be the kind of the sort of misogynist language, which is a kind of an intermittent presence in his writing. So the way in which masculinity is always a positive and femininity is always a negative, which is not to say that, I mean, there are a couple of his treatises that are addressed to women, one to his mother, who's mostly praised for being unwomanlike, and one to another woman called Marcia. But, on the whole, he's not got much time for women's experience. So I think that would be the thing I would...
That was typical at the time, though, wasn't it? I mean, it wasn't
Very
just
true.
Seneca,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes. And what's interesting, I think, about the Stoic model of virtue is that it is open to anybody to be virtuous. So within the terms of kind of Stoic philosophy, a slave can be just as virtuous as an emperor, and similarly, a woman can be, a lowly slave woman can be just as virtuous as a Roman senator. So I think that's, I think that's where there's a certain kind of redeeming character to Stoicism, is that unlike the philosophy of Aristotle, which is kind of assumes a world where the best life is the life of the aristocratic male who can take part in politics and so on. You can live an ideal life no matter what your material circumstances, no matter your bodily circumstances, as far as Seneca is concerned.
And then we've got Musonius, who is explicitly and professedly sort of a pro-women, wasn't he, when he says that women can enjoy a sort of philosophical education just as well as men. And
exactly, yeah.
I'm not sure whether Georgina wanted to ask a question again, or whether her hand has just got...
Yes, it is. Thank you. Just a minor question following up from a mention of a few names. Chris Gill, John Sellers, and I didn't get the third one you had mentioned when the question was made about therapeutic connection.
Oh. Gosh, who else did I mention? Oh, Tony Long. Yes. Okay. AA Long. Yeah.
Thank you. That's just it. Thank you.
Martha Nussbaum has a lot to say as well about Stoicism applied to the modern world, particularly about gender and anger and social justice.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Thank you.
Leah, were you? Yeah.
So I just wondered whether you felt his thoughts on friendship sort of bordered on indulgence / pleasure seeking, and how you might reconcile that with negative visualization, sleeping on hard beds, taking cold showers. What are your thoughts on that?
Sorry, I'm not sure I quite caught that. Say what the connection between, say, negative visualization and kind of making trial of yourself on the one hand, and then how, sorry, what was the link to friendship you were suggesting?
Well, just because when you were reading it out, I thought this seems a bit sort of indulgent, or he's taking a lot of pleasure out of this interaction. And I think one of the things Stoics say is don't be a slave to pleasures, try and avoid that. And, the negative visualization is about, you mentioned before, he talks about the worst things, but here he seemed to be really emphasizing all the benefits and things like that. So I don't know, are they consistent, do you think, or has he taken...
Yeah, I mean, thank you. That's a really interesting point. I mean, I think they are consistent in that I think the point about the kind of mental reflection that summons up the image of your friend is that that's actually not dependent on anything outside you. That's dependent on the image of your friend that you have in your head. No one can take that away from you. At the same time, as letter 63 underlines, you should always be, you should always be ready for the loss of your friends through death. And in fact, I mean, that's a very interesting letter, because by the time he gets to the end of it, in some ways it's a rather repellent letter, because he's going on about how Lucilis, really shouldn't be grieving. He should pull himself together. He's lost a friend. He just needs to find another friend, and so on. It always seems extremely a sort of almost a caricature of Stoic hardness. But when we get to the end of that letter, Seneca says, I've really learned this lesson the hard way, because when my friend Flaccus died, I was completely thrown by it. He was younger than me. I never expected him to die. And that's, I should have prepared myself for that. And so that's where the negative visualization would come in, just to always think, I may never see my friend again. I'm enjoying being with them now, but I may never see them again. But the kind of the converse of that is, yes, you might lose your friend, you might never see them again, but you've always got your memory of your friend, and you can always summon that up, work on summoning that up with lots of detail, and that kind of brings your friend back into your presence. And that is something that is entirely within your control, not contingent on outside circumstance.
And would you describe that as positive visualization then?
Yes, I think I would describe that as positive visualization, and I think sometimes Seneca can be very critical of pleasure, and certainly the sort of pleasures of the senses. He's got very little time for, but kind of higher pleasures, if you like, he will on occasion celebrate. And I mean, a kind of a shared philosophical project with a friend is that is a positive thing to be enjoyed, but it's a thing to be enjoyed knowing that the friend themselves might die any day, or you might die any day. I mean, so it's not, you mustn't rely on it for the future in terms of the continued life of the individuals involved. But nevertheless, you know, it can still be something that you reflect on in your own mind.
Yeah, I must admit, I really do enjoy his letters, but I do find him a little bit selective in some cases, and he has been noted for the difference between what he says and his practices. So, very interesting character.
Yes, he is a very interesting character, but we shouldn't believe everything his enemies say about him.
And it just occurred to me that Seneca actually experienced firsthand the lack of, the absence of friends and the lack of social contacts. He was in exile for 7 years, wasn't he?
Yeah, that's right. He was on the island of Corsica, and he describes his experience of exile. And that's it's interesting. I mean, he describes exile in many ways in a very positive sense, because it's an opportunity to think about philosophy uninterrupted. You know, that's great. He can just read his books. He can look at the stars.
Presumably he was writing loads as well during that time.
Yes, I mean, it's hard to know exactly what he may have written during that time. Dating Seneca's work is notoriously difficult. One treatise that's very clearly does date from that time is the one to his mother, the Ad Helviam, which is a consolation on the exile of her son. I mean, it's a very unusual text in that sense. But that is where he talks about some of the positive features of being in exile, quite different from Cicero was also in exile for a while and was completely wretched and miserable. And there's a sense, I think, actually, in which Seneca is almost, he's quite sort of subtly alluding to that example of Cicero as someone who didn't cope very well with exile, but Seneca, has got better take on it.
Yeah. So obviously he knew a thing or two when he was talking about voluntary discomforts, wasn't he?
Yes, yes.
Georgina and then Terry.
Yeah, I just wanted to say how useful I found it, that both Carmelo and Catherine, you're sharing a lot of the historical context, because it makes much more sense now how somebody is trying to adapt their philosophy to their circumstances as opposed to others, which I wasn't aware of. So I think the fact that he was in exile, it makes more sense now why also he would have a need to write about forming this type of friendship as opposed to the type that maybe others have written on.
Yeah, I think that's it is an important connection there.
Terry and then PM Singer.
Do you think that if this is about female friendship, that there will be significant differences between in the letters, in the correspondence?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question. I think when Seneca writes to his mother, he talks about how, you know, her level of familiarity with philosophical writings, which is not, I mean, it's not assumed to be very sophisticated in a way, so that she, you know, she clearly is a sort of pretty literate, you know, sophisticated, intelligent Roman woman, but he doesn't, her kind of knowledge of the more technical side of philosophy is assumed to be much more limited by Seneca. And he doesn't really, yes, it's interesting, he doesn't, in terms of kind of interaction with women, I mean, he talks about his wife's affection for him, but not really about how that might feed into a kind of a more philosophical kind of development. So I'd say that he's not, and as only friendships between women are not something he's particularly interested in. For when he's talking to Marcia, he's reproving her for excessive grief for her son who's died some years previously. And I mean, he holds out particular female role models for her. So he says, you know, you should try to be like Augustus's wife Livia, and who overcame her grief for her son. So there's a sense there of kind of the usefulness of the role model, which is quite a kind of standard Roman thing to invoke. But it's I wouldn't say it's working in the same sort of intensity and duration as the kind of imaginative use of role models or the imaginative invocation of friends that we see at work in the letters.
Thank you. Pian Singer.
Oh, thank you. Hi, Catherine. Thanks very much for that. Yeah, I was very interested in this this notion of the friendship as a work of art, or as a kind of creation, and what it means to become a worthy friend. This passage you mentioned about you haven't yet become a worthy friend, but you're becoming it, and what that involves. So I suppose to look at it the other way around, what benefit Seneca then gets out of this friendship. I mean, we touched on that question a bit before, this question of what the benefit is to Seneca. He should be sort of self-sufficient without it. But I was interested more in the question of, what's involved in that process of becoming the worthy friend. You might think it's, well, just becoming a better Stoic. The more like-minded you become, then the better friend you are. But then you also might think, well, then if you imagine interaction with people who are too like-minded, it's going to be pretty predictable. And you presumably need to preserve some sort of individuality or kind of unpredictability in the friend. So I wondered if you had a bit more to say about that.
Yeah,
of becoming the better friend, becoming the more worthy friend.
Well, that's a very interesting question.
What it's like after that, as it were.
Yes, I mean, I suppose in a way it's a bit like that. That whether you think that anyone can ever become a Stoic sage, or is that only ever a goal that you move towards, you never arrive at it. And so similarly with friendship, you and your friend become more like one another, but you're never going to become exactly alike. And there's a sense in which, I mean, I suppose one becomes a better friend by perhaps, part of what's going on in the letters is this sense of offering advice to one another. So a friend is someone who can see your faults and take you to task for them and help you to become your normative self, I suppose. Yeah. I mean, I think that it is about that sort of mutual scrutiny, if you like, that friends observe one another's habitual practices and say, I think you need to work on your anger a bit more, or I think you need to, you were getting a bit emotional about, your brother-in-law, but you need to, so that sort of sense of offering constructive criticism is a kind of a key aspect of what friendship should be like.
So it might be a process of kind of approaching the same level in your progress, rather than it being a mentor,
yes,
or QT relationship.
Well, certainly. I mean, Seneca, he shifts around. Sometimes he talks about, you are my creation, but then other times he says, it's just like we're both patients in hospital and we're in adjacent beds, and it's like, we're both undergoing a cure. So it's kind of, so sometimes it's a relationship of approximate equality, and sometimes it's one where there's more of a gap between Seneca, the kind of teacher, and Lucilius, the pupil.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yes.
Great. I think we've run out of questions. That's very interesting, Catherine. Thank you so much. Much obliged. I don't know. I mean, we can. I'll stop the recording.
Figure out what the shortcomings of following the Stoic approach are. And I know I've had discussions with people who think it's terrible and stuff. I just wondered, from your perspective, what are the holes? Where does it fall short in terms of its thinking? given your expertise?
I suppose I feel it's a philosophy that has particular strengths when you're in a situation where you can't make changes. So in terms of helping you to adapt to circumstances being different from what you would want them to be. I think it's less good at kind of perhaps helping one to kind of take action. So and that may be partly, you know, the idea that you might want to change things in the world. That Seneca's not tremendously interested in exploring mechanisms by which you do that. And again, I think that may be partly to do with, certainly in the letters, the time in his life when he's writing them, particular political circumstances under which he's writing them. You know, that you know, very constrained political circumstances where there isn't an opportunity really for kind of public debate or in initiating change in a kind of in terms of a sort of established political process. So yeah.
Thanks. And just out of interest, are there any philosophies that do address those shortcomings you've identified?
Well, I suppose, I mean, sometimes in some moods, Plato is pretty kind of revolutionary, isn't he? But that not necessarily in a way that is easily put into effect.
Thank you. Thanks.
Paul?
Hi, Catherine, could you clear up something for me that's come into my mind? So there's a fragment of Chrysippus that's preserved in Stoic, where he's talking about these kinds of philosophical friendships, and that the drive behind them is erotic. So I don't know whether that's our misunderstanding of the term, or do you think an erotic element is important in these friendships, or what does that fragment mean?
Well, I mean, certainly in terms of, I mean, if one goes back to Plato's Symposium, there's a kind of sense in which an erotic relationship between an older man and a younger man can actually have a very positive philosophical dimension to it, that kind of loving the beautiful becomes is kind of that initially physical urge is kind of made into a transcendent philosophical one. So within the Platonic tradition, that is a connection that's very much there. Now, within Stoicism, I mean that there's, I think it's letter 116, Seneca talks about, you know, whether the wise man can be a lover, and the sort of sense of whether the way that one imagines the wise man includes scope for erotic relationships. And Seneca's not very keen on that idea, because I mean, or at least he says, well, the wise man can do it because the wise man knows where to draw the line. The wise man's not going to get carried away by his emotions, but for the rest of us, no. You know, so that there, I think, is another example of kind of the wise man as actually an impossible ideal, that we're never actually going to become a wise man. So one can attribute all sorts of possibilities to the wise man without them ever needing to be made available to anybody, because nobody's ever going to become the wise man. Does that sort of, I mean, that's it. It's interesting, that bit of Chrysippus, and I should go back and have another look at it. But
I suppose it's to do with whether that's necessarily a drive in friendships, perhaps in our understanding today as well. In that, I suppose that it would seem that in Roman Greece, the family structure was based on a different structure to the one we have now. So they wouldn't necessarily be thinking about always having those relationships defined in that way. So there's just kind of some thoughts bubbling around in my head, but I think you've addressed them.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Thank you. And shall we have one last question from Louis?
Yeah, I mean, really to go back to Plato and Socrates again. I mean, there was a big emphasis on the kind of dialectic discovery of philosophy from questioning and from forwards and backwards, and through most of the works of Plato. Now, despite Seneca kind of belaboring the benefits of friendship, there's no sense that there's any kind of, that I could see, philosophical discovery as a result of the dialogue, as a result of the dialectic.
You may be right that that's not a particularly significant emphasis, that he is interested in philosophical discovery, but I think dialogue's primary role is a therapeutic role and an educational role, so that the person who is, an individual will be benefited in terms of their kind of ethical disposition by the dialogue. But it's perhaps not, I mean, he is interested in kind of logical questions, and so, although he also occasionally in the letters will kind of be rather dismissive of the more technical side of philosophy. I mean, I think it is partly a question of genre here, in that, letters are not supposed to be particularly technical. In fact, Seneca does have quite a bit of technical philosophical stuff in his letters, but it might be for that reason that we have perhaps less of a sense of kind of the technicalities of argument as such. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right, if there's no further questions, I think we may want to call it a day. Wouldn't want to abuse your time and kindness, Catherine.
It's been a pleasure, and
you've been very generous with your time. Thank you very much.
And thank you for your really interesting questions. It's been a pleasure to meet you all.
Yeah, that's been quite an engaging, interesting conversation, actually.
Definitely.
That's really, really interesting. Okay, well, as I said, the next meeting will be sometime in July, mid-month, and the facilitator will be Tim LeBon. Okay, thanks for coming all.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very
much. Bye-bye.
Bye.